if you're a startup trying to break into the enterprise, if you want to sell to SMBs, that's different. But if you want to sell to large enterprises, that's where your ambition is. It's very difficult because large enterprises are, in general, conservative and in general risk averse and in general not willing to bet on a startup, and they want some validation from an analyst who's heard of them and talks about them and gives them some comfort that they're making a good decision. So they want to try something new that'll solve a problem, but that validation and advocacy of an analyst weighs very heavily in that market.
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the E-Marketing Association Power Marketing podcasts. Here's Kevin.
Hi, I'm Kevin Lee with the E-Marketing Association. My day job is that I run Did It, which is most of my week, actually. Also have a brand, Truth Nutrition, that lets me run a bunch of marketing experiments if I want, and a nonprofit, Giving Forward, that runs a replacement for Amazon Smile, but also happened to be at an event recently where I ran into Robin Schaffer. New York Tech Day has an event here in New York, and Robin was there talking about what it was that she does at her booth. So, Robin, thanks for joining me on the show. From chatting with you there, I learned all about the analyst relations category of PR, which is a little bit more niche than regular PR. So for those folks who don't understand analyst relations, and particularly in context for the startup community, why don't you sort of give your elevator pitch?
Yeah. Well, if I'm telling my grandmother, what analyst relations is, so we start there. I always use the analogy of consumer reports. Right? So if you want to buy a toaster or a car or whatever, a consumer will go to this old-time magazine, Consumer Reports, and see reports. There are analysts behind those reports that become experts on toasters or cars or whatever it is. And the same thing happens in the B2B tech world. So instead of consumers, these are business buyers, so businesses, enterprises that need to acquire technology specific to technology that businesses use, will consult an analyst. And the data shows that in the enterprise, 75% of all enterprise decisions are affected by industry analysts. People have read or follow these analysts, what they say, or they have inquiry calls with them. They get their advice. So these analysts have quite an impact on the business, the B2B technology marketplace. So it behooves vendors of all sizes, including startups all the way up, to pay attention, because what they want to do is get on the radar of these analysts. They want them to know about them. And the interesting things, particularly about startups, because I worked for much larger companies most of my career, and what I've observed was this really interesting situation where analysts were hungry. They want to know about innovation, so they want to know what's going on in the startup community. And startups don't know about analysts or think that they're too small and that nobody cares about them. So it's like I bridge the gap, particularly for startups. But I work with all size companies, working for the vendors, representing them to these industry analysts.
Great. Well, I think a lot of folks also, I've heard in conversations over the years that people get a little bit confused between the industry analysts and stock analysts, which are the investor relations team. Once something is either about to go public or goes public, there's a whole separate group of analysts who are stock analysts, and they serve a different role, but they have a very similar title. So within the industry analyst ecosystem, there's certainly a different set of analysts in the sort of tech and MarTech and ad tech world than there are potentially in other categories. So which analyst types are you typically interacting with when you're working with a startup or a mid-sized organization or even an enterprise organization?
Okay, so you are correct that the word analyst is terrible because it can mean not only those two type of analysts, but there's so many different kind of analysts in the world.
Right.
But just for the audience, the financial analysts, the stock analysts are really looking at companies from their financial perspective, trying to understand if this is a healthy investment and following, and they know some about their technologies because that helps inform them but they're not experts in that.
Right.
The industry analysts, mildly care about their finances, company's finances, but they're very, very interested in what the company does, what they produce, the value they provide to the market. So there are about 8 or 10,000 analysts in the world. And that number seems to change all the time, but something like that. And they cover, each analyst has either a domain expertise, usually they have either a domain expertise, meaning they're a cybersecurity expert, or they're a CRM expert, or they're, all these different technology categories. They have different analysts that become experts in that. Then there are analysts that are experts from a industry perspective. So they may follow the healthcare industry and understand the technologies that go on in that industry. Not deeply, because you have the same domains in those industries, but they'll understand the technologies that are specific to that industry and understand the trends going on there. And then there are regional analysts that care about the Nordics or APAC, where they're also very broad. They're not looking at a particular type of technology, but they're looking at the trends, the uptake, what's happening, what people are using in that market. So within the technology domain, I know within cybersecurity alone, my friend Richard Stein, an analyst that focuses on that, says, I think he says there are 462 categories of cybersecurity. So even within a category, there are subcategories, and there are just analysts that cover anything a business is going to buy, technology a business is going to buy. It probably has an analyst that covers that and is an expert in it.
Right. Well, that's very helpful. Certainly, once you reach sort of going concern level as a business, folks at least have the perception that a lot of these analyst companies are purely pay to play. Like the only way you end up even to be considered to be in one of the quadrants, whether you end up in the upper right, which is good, or you end up somewhere else, which is bad, right? They believe the whole thing is pay to play. As a matter of fact, they believe that how far up and to the right you end up is directly correlated to how much you pay.
That's
so is that an accurate or partially accurate perception on behalf of these?
I think there is a little bit of accuracy to that. I think mostly the big analysts that everybody cares about, Forrester, Gartner, and IDC, those are the 3 names that everybody knows and everybody cares about, would never risk. Their reputation is with the buyers. They have to maintain their buyer reputation. They can't afford to be biased towards vendors because that kills them as an advisor to buyers. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So they protect that. That is not to say that there are not analyst firms in the world that you can pay to write nice things about you. But the big ones that really matter will never do that. And you cannot spend enough to impact them and to change them. Now, I say there is some truth to it, because there is something that happens when you buy a subscription to an analyst firm. You get access to their research and you get access to the analysts. Okay. What that does, if you're smart about using that access in inquiry time, you can build that relationship much stronger than you can if you're not a client. So if you're not a client, your limit is to occasionally brief them, which is a one-way conversation about what's going on in your business. Mm-hmm. Very hard to build a relationship, very hard to move perceptions based on that. You can chip away at it. But when you can have a two-way dialogue and talk openly with an analyst about their perceptions of something, or their concerns about something, or your strengths or the market, you can really move their perception, and you build something. There's something very different qualitatively about the relationship when you move from a one-way to a two-way. So yes, buying a subscription and buying that, getting that access does impact, because you have a better shot at moving your way above into the magic quadrant or the wave than if you are not a customer. But you do not have to be a customer to get on them or to perform really well on them.
That's great to know. So what leverage does the startup have? Is it because they're sort of in this temporarily sexy state where they're maybe solving a problem that, is new or is solved in a new and unique way? And so therefore the analyst needs to know about them? Is that the
Yes.
catalyst?
That is very, very accurate. And analysts value to their customers. So if I'm a buyer, I'm looking into a particular space, I'm looking at the technologies in that space, and I talk to an analyst, and the analyst talks to me about the obvious Salesforce, Microsoft, the obvious Oracle, big vendors that play in that space. Well, I know that already. I mean, maybe they give me some insights on that, but they have not rocked my world here.
Right.
But when I'm looking at it and they say, there's this startup that is doing some really innovative things in your space, and I think you should check them out. The analyst has delivered value to that client. They want to deliver value to the client, and they deliver value to the client by understanding the whole market, not just the obvious players. Right. So they want to know what's happening in innovation, whether it's innovation that's happening within a large company, because that happens, or where most of the innovation happens, which is in the startup level. They are very hungry to pay attention and see what's happening. And I've even had analysts say to me, I want to hear about these startups at the napkin stage. If they have something truly disruptive and innovative, I want to know about it. I want to be the first one to discover them, to talk about them. So now as a startup, you can get an analyst advocating for you in the market for free. They don't charge for this. And they can be talking about you. And right. There's a natural win-win there by pulling those things together. Analysts are also, what they'll tell you is, my time is precious, and most startups don't know how to engage with me. Right. So, for example, they'll get on with a startup who will give them their sales pitch and full of marketing, and and they don't want to hear that. They don't know how to engage with them, and that's frustrating. So there's a need for startups to engage with analysts in the right and effective ways.
Right. And it sounds like that's really sort of your expertise, in that you make sure that the analyst's time is not wasted, because it's one of their most valuable assets, and that you find a way to help the startup break through the clutter, right, in a way that resonates with that analyst.
Exactly. The other thing that getting an analyst to be an advocate for you does is it gives you credibility. Because if you're a startup trying to break into the enterprise, if you want to sell to SMBs, that's different. But if you want to sell to large enterprises, that's where your ambition is. It's very difficult, because large enterprises are, in general, conservative, and in general, risk averse, and in general, not willing to bet on a startup, and they want some validation from an analyst who's heard of them and talks about them and gives them some comfort that they're making a good decision. So they want to, try something new that'll solve a problem, but that validation and advocacy of an analyst weighs very heavily in that market.
So I've noticed that a bunch of sectors also have buyers looking for, I guess, validation and information using some of these platforms, which are more driven off of the user's interaction, like the Capteras and G2s of the world, right? So do those, from the perspective of how the startup should be using their time and allocating, let's say either their internal sort of analyst relations resources or PR resources across sort of the Capterra G2 ecosystem or whatever it is for their category versus analysts? Is there like a rule of thumb as to how they should balance their effort
God,
and
is there a rule of
energy
thumb?
there?
I think it's so dependent on what they're selling and who they're selling it to.
I see.
Those sites are particularly valuable at the SMB stage. If you're selling to SMB audiences,
Right.
they rely more on those sites than they go to analysts, and they rely on analysts. But they all do. They all rely on those sites, but there's more of a bent toward that. I think if you're, like I said before, if your ambition is to sell into the enterprise, it's really critical for you to double down on the analyst angle. Still not abandon that, but still do that. The thing about the peer review sites that's interesting is if you want to be in a Gartner Magic Quadrant, then it's very important to be in Gartner's Peer Insights, Gartner's version, because they rely and look at the customer ratings in judging and evaluating you. So if you're trying to get onto that analyst radar, or you're trying to perform, you're there and you're trying to perform better, very critical to have a plan to build up your Gartner peer, to build up your reviews on that site, and good reviews. G2 and Trust Radius are the other two that are, very prominent and have very good companies. They have very good reviews. I feel like as a company, especially as a small company, even a large company, nobody has unlimited resources and unlimited amounts of customers to ask to review you. So you've got to understand these different sites, study them a little bit, and make a bet on which one you want to tackle first, and put your eggs in that basket, and try not to spread it too thin. It's a whole strategy about how you do it. The thing that is important to recognize is that analysts, the Gartner analysts look at GPI, Gartner Peer Insights, so that's established. But other analysts, Forrester analysts, IDC analysts, and the other 100 analyst firms in the world, 1,000 analyst firms in the world, look to, they want to get a customer perspective, they'll look to these sites. They might have one that's a favorite that they look to. So you're influencing analysts beyond Gartner through those sites. Gartner's the only one that owns one.
Right. Yeah, that's a fascinating insight, and does help, I guess, guide, the internal or external PR analyst and public relations teams with regards to sort of where to focus their efforts and in which order.
Yeah.
I have sort of an interesting follow-up question that popped into my head. So you mentioned that in cybersecurity, there were literally hundreds of subsectors. Yet, and so new things are getting invented all the time, particularly right now in the areas of AI. There's all sorts of different types of AI, right? There's LLM AI, there's, AI-focused databases like vector databases. And so how do the analyst organizations decide, oh, this is a new category, right? And is there one that's more likely to sort of branch off the category first and say, this is different enough than sort of the meta category above it that it needs its own, it needs its own quadrant, it needs its own analysis. Maybe even it needs its own analysts, right? That seems like a pretty difficult decision for them to make.
It is a difficult decision for them to make, and they're going to make it. It's a great question, and something that is on and should be on most companies' minds, not just startups, but most companies' minds. They consider themselves the definer of categories.
Right.
So when a vendor comes and says, we think there should be a new category, they take it with a grain of, they don't want to hear that. So that is something you want to dance very carefully around with analysts.
Right.
There are different kinds of analysts. There are different personalities. There are people that are going to die on the category that they invented 30 years ago, and nobody's going to convince them otherwise. And then there are analysts that are real open-minded and curious and really interested in new things and new ways to look at things. So you need to understand a little bit about the analyst and how and that owns that category, that owns that report, and how they think. The way they decide is frankly based on the customer inquiries that they get from buyers. So the more they see buyers struggling with an area and a lot of vendors, pooling up into an area and see a need that's not being addressed by the way they've categorized things yet, they'll slowly, because they're very slow to do this, the Gartners of the world, will define something new. So it's an important part of category creation to figure out how you're going to work with the analyst community around that category, because they'll miscategorize you. Is that bad if you end up in a quadrant it's not exactly the right quadrant for you? Boy, that's a good philosophical argument. Is it better to be on it a little bit, represented than not be anywhere at all? Real interesting discussion, but understanding, first of all, there's never don't be a category of one, and that's a common thing. People define themselves. I'm the only left-handed octopus, kind of thing that, we should have a category for left-handed octopuses. And, they don't want to hear that. If there's a number of vendors, 15, 20, 25 vendors in a space, they'll start to think about a category.
Interesting. I thought about, when you use the idea of vendors in a space, I'm old enough to have been through the creation of a bunch of spaces, right? And I've also seen and been part of, the creation of trade associations, right? For a space that didn't exist before, right? So while the association doesn't exist anymore, there was SEMPO, the Search Engine Marketing Professional Organization, right? Which I was a founding board member of, and that ended up merging with the Digital Analytics Association and then sort of disappeared. Because sort of its reason for existence was no longer as strong, right? Because in the beginning, nobody knew what search engine marketing was, the difference between paid and organic. And, we sort of had to get the word out. And I think to some extent, the fact that a bunch of players in the category sort of pooled their resources to start an association, to some extent, put that category on the radar of analysts as well, right? So
I so see that. That
Yeah.
makes so much sense as a pathway to getting the category created.
Right, right. So have you seen situations where in lieu of the category sort of having been created at the analysts, because perhaps they're a little bit slower, that you've seen industry trade associations sort of spring up with the educational mission of educating the market on the category as a whole?
I have never thought about that, honestly, but it makes so much sense. And I haven't, personally observed that,
Right.
but it is a brilliant way to take your steps into that creation of that category. You first prove the category is needed by a lot of members and a lot of vendors and a lot of interest in the area, and they take notice of those things.
Right.
So it's quite brilliant.
Oh, well, I hope I get to do it someday again. Well, is there anything else that we didn't cover that folks who are looking to sort of interact with the analyst community should know but don't know?
Oh my God, that's such a good question. And I could go on for days, but let me just try to think of an idea. Well, the one thing that we talked a little bit about pay for play, and that it's not really pay for play. I really believe in guerrilla analyst relations, which means I watch my clients' budgets like I watch my own wallet, right? I often come up with clients that believe it's pay to play and are ready to write a check to these, firms. And I stop them because I say, first, we need to educate them and get on the awareness. You're a startup. You're going to get a break. They're not going to expect yet an investment. And we work towards getting on their radar, marketing, getting brand awareness, getting out there until we get to the point where it makes a lot of sense and we can get a lot of value out of that investment. So I always, tell people that we're going to take a step-by-step approach to going all in analyst relations. And then when you're in with one firm, you take a step with another firm, and you grow that way. So it does not have to start off. You don't have to say, I don't have the money to do analyst relations. You should start today. You should start now and build up that program as you go through time.
So it sounds like what you're saying is there's a unique choreography to analyst relations that is potentially industry specific, but also company specific based on where they are in their journey.
Totally.
Right. And getting that choreography closer to perfect, means you'll get more bang for your buck or more bang for your time, whatever.
Exactly. And you're right that every company there's a different way to play this. There's a different, rule book, how to get value. And that's one of the things I pride myself on is, going into a client and I start with the attitude of what's the least amount of money and effort we can put into this for the maximum amount of value. Find that sweet spot and then work there, start there today, and then let the experience take us to where it wants to go to the next steps.
Right. One interesting thing I hadn't thought of until this moment, but there are SEO implications to analyst relations because analyst websites tend to rank pretty well, as do the G2s, Trustpilots, and Capterras of the world.
Yes.
And not only is that important from an SEO perspective, given a good old-fashioned Google search engine results page, but the LLMs are ingesting content, right, and making decisions about who's the best at something.
Yes.
Based on this information that's out there in the customer review sites, at the analyst sites, obviously co-created content, all the other forms of digital PR that one might be engaging with. But I hadn't thought about it from sort of an SEO and future proofing of SEO basis because of the LLMs until I started to think about
makes sense.
the crawlability of these analyst sites, right? And it's not just humans visiting there to look and decide, but it's LLMs going there to look and decide.
Well, it's interesting. I wrote a book on analyst relations. I wrote the second edition of it last year, and I added a chapter on AI because I wanted to ask the analysts, how do you think AI is going to affect the analyst job, right? Because I think they're the ultimate knowledge worker, right? They're how if it disrupts them, we're in trouble, right?
Yeah.
So one of the analysts was talking about the key to the future is making your data, what data you make available for these things to crawl. Because maybe you want them to crawl it, maybe you don't want, you want that to be exclusive to your paying customers. And he talked a lot about making data available to LLMs as being part of the factor that they have to figure out.
Yeah, I mean, publishers in general, especially subscription-based publishers, have had that conundrum for a long time, and they solved it with like floating out abstracts and using other methodologies to let the search engines get an understanding of what the information is there without necessarily, losing control of it, right? So it's a fine line you need to tiptoe for any premium information holder, right? Is how do you maintain SEO visibility and now LLM visibility, right, without giving the farm away?
A big problem, a big challenge.
Yeah, for sure. Well, lots of great stuff that we covered, Robin. So pleased you could join me and educate myself and the viewers/listeners on analyst relations. Thanks so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Really great talking to you, Kevin.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in The Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.